I'm Russell Eyrig from the Cincinnati Art Museum, and for today's CamDo, we're going to tackle one of the most fundamental lessons, light and shadow. Now, without light, you can't see, so it's a pretty important part of art. So one of the easiest ways to focus on light and shadow is to create a still life where color is not going to be a distraction. So try to find a few objects that are solid white, or close enough. Since the focus is on light and shadow, try not to pick things that are too complicated. Look for basic shapes. I would also recommend using a white towel or sheet as a base and a backdrop. For mine, I added a complication, which is a transparent glass, but if you're new to drawing, you might want to keep it a little bit simpler with just opaque objects. But if you do want a challenge, trying to draw glass or something transparent will add a level of challenge. Now, because this is a drawing about light, also consider your light source. Where is it coming from? If you can, trying to limit it to one light source to make your life a lot easier. The more light sources, the more complicated everything will get. It's also good to make sure your light source remains consistent as you draw. So if you're using natural light, maybe don't start it at sunset. This will largely be an exercise in value, which is something I've talked about before. Value just means the whole range of shades between black and white, and there are many ways to create it. I made my drawing digitally, which might be an option for you, but if not, I would recommend using something soft like charcoal or graphite. So the harder you press, the darker the mark, and the softer you press, the lighter the mark. You probably want to begin by lightly sketching to get the basic shapes and proportions of your objects. You want to draw really lightly so you can make corrections at this stage. It's a lot easier to do it now than later. Try to imagine invisible lines between the objects and look for those angles to help you keep those proportions correct. Looking for the points where those objects overlap is also really helpful. That's actually what made me notice a really big mistake I had made, and I noticed it way later than I would have liked to. It would have been a lot easier for me to correct that early on. Once I have my basic composition laid out, I put down a layer of a sort of middle tone gray all over the surface. I find that because most of the values in the piece are going to be somewhere in that middle gray zone, it's helpful just to get everything to gray, and then I can lighten or darken as needed. At this point, it can be really helpful to think of everything as just three tones: middle gray, light, and dark. Your brightest areas should be on the sides of the objects that are closer to your light source, and the darkest areas will probably be on the side away from your light source. You can tell in my image that the light is behind my still life because the shadows are coming towards me. Look for the absolute brightest part of your still life. Maybe it's the reflection off of a shiny object, but whatever it is, that part should be white. Now, if that is the brightest part of your drawing and it's white, nothing else should be that white. Everything else should at least be a little bit grayer than that. Now look for your absolute darkest part. If you make that your absolute black, then everything else should be a little bit lighter than that. Squinting your eyes to blur the image can sometimes help, or if you're blessed with nearsightedness, you can do what I do and just take off your glasses. You wouldn't think that having poor vision would be a benefit to drawing, but it really can be in that it lets you sort of turn off the details and lets you focus on the big picture. This project can also be a great way to learn that an eraser is a drawing tool and not just for correcting mistakes. I probably spent as much time drawing with my eraser as I did with my pencil. And many of those initial lines that you drew in black, they might actually be white or lighter than darker. That was especially true with that glass that I drew, and especially around the rim. Another great tool you might want to use is a tortillon, which is a fancy word that just means a rolled up piece of paper that you use to blend areas together, or sometimes people will just call it a blending stump. So that can be an option for you. I typically actually just use a paper towel. I can just use the whole sheet if I'm blending a big area, or I can scrunch it up for little tiny details. So for me, a paper towel works fine, but you might like a tortillon better. And something to also keep in mind is that not everything needs blending. Sometimes seeing your little pencil marks help give a sense of texture to the objects. And it's really just up to you to decide what looks good and what doesn't. And those types of decisions that you make are what separates your work from somebody else's. Now, I said earlier that the darkest part of an object will be farthest away from the light source, and that would be true in outer space, but something else to consider is how light reflects. So you have a lot of reflections even in shadows. So if you look on the darkest edges of some of your objects, you might see some light bouncing back into that shadows. So a lot of times that very edge is actually going to be reflecting back some of the white from the nearby objects or the towel or paper you have laid down. You can actually see that pretty clearly in my stones, that they're reflecting the light back from the towel. And so the part that you might expect to be the darkest is actually not. It's a little bit further up into the stone that maybe is the darkest area. So now if you're brave enough to try drawing a transparent object, you'll also have to deal with something called refraction. That just means the way light is bent through a transparent object, and it distorts the other objects that you might be seeing through that transparent glass or whatever it is you're drawing. So in my still life, you can see this most clearly with the ball behind the glass. We know it's a perfect sphere, but that's not how it appears as the glass warps its shape. And as you move, so will the distortion, so this can be really tricky. So I hope you have a good time making your still life, and I hope it teaches you a little bit more about light and shadow.